All right, how's everybody doing? So I'm going to talk about culture and revolution today. And let's start with culture. So culture is one of those things where when I was an entrepreneur, and I first started out, I asked everybody smart I knew who had run a company or was a venture capitalist or somebody, like what did I need to focus on from like a company building management perspective. And I got a wide variety of answers, and a lot of VCs would say, hire A players and that kind of thing, which was always great advice because I was going to hire a bunch of idiots, and that cleared it right up for me. But the advice that I got from the guys who really knew how to build companies was like, culture is really important. They would all say, yeah, culture, you got to focus on the culture, Ben. And I would be, okay, do you have anything beyond the platitude? Or is like that just it, like culture? Like, could you explain to me what do you mean by culture even? And it was always very difficult for them to do that. And then as I became a venture capitalist and I work with companies and work with CEOs, this is the main thing that people don't even know where to begin. They get very confused on. And even for larger, really successful companies, it can get away from you, And so I thought that would be a really good thing to talk about. And it turns out that the best way to understand culture is through significant revolution. Okay, so first of all, what is culture? This is not culture. So dogs at work, yoga, organic food, that's not culture. It's perks. There's a difference between culture and perks. This is not about perks. This isn't culture either. Corporate above and beyond, independent integrity. These could be aspects of culture, but like you create corporate values and you put them on a wall, like that's not going to get you a culture. And this is not a talk about corporate values and revolution. This is about culture. So what is culture? So this is a picture of me in the middle. You might recognize me. On the left to me is Admiral John Richardson, a friend of mine who runs the Navy. And when I say he runs the Navy, this isn't the Secretary of the Navy, the appointee. This is the CNO, the guy who spent 10 years underwater running nuclear subs, the guy who really runs the Navy, the guy who came up that way. And then the guy on my right is my friend Shaka Senghor, who spent 19 years in prison, and while in prison, ran one of the largest, I'll call it prisoner organizations. And we got together, I thought I'd get them together to talk about culture because they were two of the best guys I knew with insights about running organizations. And if you think that was just my crazy idea, you can see the admirals holding Shaka's book. So like they had a lot in common. And we talked about culture, and the reason I wanted to talk to them is they both had organizations where culture really mattered. Because if somebody comes into the Navy and they don't become part of the culture, and they don't do things in the way you need to do them in the Navy, they die. And that's the same thing in prison. You come into prison, you don't do things the right way, you die. And it's not that funny if you're in prison, but anyway. And so in talking to them, and Admiral Richardson went through, look, it starts with who comes into the organization. And he pointed out, look, we have an advantage because we're a volunteer service, we're a volunteer Navy, and it turns out that nearly half of our people actually come from people who were also in the Navy or somewhere in the armed forces, and so they're already into the culture as soon as we get them. And he said, I'll take it even further. It's like in the Navy SEALs program, anybody can try out and go through the training, and there's a very high failure rate, and I know who's going to fail with 95% accuracy just based on a psychological exam that we give them going in. It's not a physical thing. It's a physical test, but it's your psychology that determines it. Are you ready for that culture? On the other side, in talking to Shaka, Shaka says, one thing that really shaped the culture is the decisions that you make. I said, well, give me an example of that. He said, well, look, if a guy comes in and steals one of my guys' toothpaste, what I do there, that decision is going to matter a lot. And I'm like, well, if he steals a toothpaste, he's just very concerned with dental hygiene. Like, aren't you going to let him go on that? Like, he wants clean teeth with the, come on, man. He's like, no. He's like, you don't steal toothpaste in prison because you care about your teeth. That's a diagnostic. That's to determine if I can rape you, if I can kill you, if I can hurt you, or anybody associated with you. That's a diagnostic. So how I react, that determines the safety of all my guys. So the easy thing to do is kill the guy. Not the easy, but like that's the easy decision, right? Like you kill him, you protect your crew. But I make that decision to be that violent. My culture is that violent. Everybody making their own decision is just that violent. So this is how culture grows. And so when we talk about culture, these are the things we're talking about. We're talking about important decisions. We're talking about how you recruit, how you run the organization, decisions you make. And in a company, it ends up manifesting itself in a lot of different ways. But what it really comes down to is it is the collective behavior of your organization. This is who you are. You know, it's funny to read because CEOs go, well, that's not us. It's like, well, that's how you act. That's what you do. It's not us. It is you. It's your collective behavior. It's your culture that creates that environment. And it's what you do, it's what your people do when you're not giving them a direction, which is, guess what? Anybody who's run anything, 99% of the time, you're not telling people what to do. They're doing it on their own. They're making their own decisions. What do they do when you're not looking? Well, you do what your way of doing things is. And if you don't make that explicit, it will just create itself. It'll just grow that way. It'll just do those things. People want to harass each other, they'll harass each other. You know, people want to lie to customers, they'll lie to customers. Unless you set it, it'll just be what it is. So some examples of how this shows up in a company. Does your company get back to people when they call them, or do they just like drop them on the floor because like we're great, like we don't need to call you back? Are you open to new ideas? Is data more important or is intuition more important? Does a job title impact who's right and wrong? Do you show up on time? Or does people wait a half hour for your meetings? This is all your culture. Do you use your own products? Does craftsmanship matter? Is it okay to take risks? Is watching what you spend important? One empty box. Do you even tell the truth? Because you're the CEO, you're going, oh, I'll tell you one thing and I'll tell you something else. You think that doesn't run downhill. You don't think that doesn't matter. And like everybody from your HR person to your managers feels totally comfortable just making stuff up. Well, they will if that's the culture you set. So I know if you were like me and you're an entrepreneur, you're going, okay, great. This is great, Ben. You're telling us all about culture and how important it is. But guess what? Like I already missed half this stuff. I made a lot of decisions. I didn't even know that what I was getting into. So like, is it possible to change? And the good news is it is. And I'm going to take you through a historical example. And this brings me to Toussaint. In the entire history of humanity, there's been exactly one successful slave revolution. One. Now think about that. Slavery's been around a long time, basically all of written history. It's endorsed by the Bible and the Quran. And if you don't believe me, you don't know your Bible, because it's not only endorsed, they have like special rules about it. In 1600, I think, nearly half the world's population was enslaved. And yet there's never been a successful revolution, or there's only been one. So why? Plenty of motivation. Like, why didn't the slaves of the Han dynasty rise up and win? Why didn't the Gauls rise up and defeat the Romans? Why didn't the Christians rise up and take down the Ottoman Empire? Why did Nat Turner fail so fast? Like, what is it that stopped every revolution but one from winning? Culture. Turns out slave culture is absolutely detrimental to winning a revolution. What is it about slave culture? Well, one, when you're a slave, your life isn't worth much. You don't own anything. Your relationships are nothing. Your family can be taken away from you at any point. You can't invest in your future, and then you're not even generally allowed to learn to read or anything. So what does that mean? Well, you have then a culture that's got real challenges. You've got low trust. You've got no long-term planning. The population is generally ignorant and superstitious, and there's very low loyalty. And none of this is conducive to winning a war. So how did an ex-slave, a person who was a slave most of his life, well into his middle age, reprogram his culture, reprogram himself, reprogram an entire slave culture, and lead the only successful slave revolution ever? How did that happen? And a lot of you guys are probably engineers and you're going, well, maybe the circumstances of that slavery weren't as bad as the slavery we've read about. So I thought I would read you a little bit about the slavery that Toussaint came up in. Whipping was interrupted in order to pass a piece of hot wood on the buttocks of the victim. Salt, pepper, citron, cinders, aloes, and hot ashes were poured on bleeding wounds. Mutilations were common, limbs, ears, and sometimes private parts, to deprive them of the pleasures which they could indulge in without expense. Their masters poured burning wax on their arms, hands, and shoulders, emptied boiling cane sugar over their heads, burned them alive, roasted them on slow fires, filled them with gunpowder, and blew them up with a match. I'm not even going to go on anymore. It's hard to read. This was the worst slavery. This was some of the worst slave conditions in the history of humankind. So bad, I'll quantify it. U.S. slavery is known as a pretty brutal form of slavery. During the slave trade, 1 million slaves were brought to the U.S. At the end of slavery, there were 4 million slaves. People had babies, the population grew. In the Caribbean, 2 million slaves were brought during the course of slavery. At the end of slavery in the Caribbean, 700,000 slaves were left. That's how many people got killed. That's how bad it was. That's how brutal it was. This was the environment in which he changed the culture. But it went beyond that. The advantages of being white were so obvious that race prejudice against Negroes permeated the minds of the mulattoes, who so bitterly represented the same thing from the whites. Black slaves and mulattoes hated each other. The man of color, who was nearly white, despised the man of color who was only half white, who in turn despised the man of color who was only a quarter white, and so on through the shades. This is the environment we're talking about. It was not an easy environment to change the culture. Beyond that, in the region, there were many previous attempts. I'll talk quickly about 2 of them. The first was led by a gentleman named Francois Mackin Dahl, 1758. Now, Mackin Dahl was a super charismatic guy, tall, much taller than Toussaint, very good looking, great warrior, but not at all focused on culture. So not focused on culture, and they would do the whole thing. They would win, they'd rape, they'd pillage. And then if somebody did something wrong to him, he would poison them. Like one of his own guys, he would poison his own guys if they did something he didn't like. Now think about how deceptive that is. Like, not confront them, not deal with them, poison them. Some people know corporate cultures like that. Now, the way this ended for him was his own people turned him over to the slave masters who burned him alive. And so he was actually defeated by the culture he set. The second example, a guy by the name of Vincent Auger, he tried to run the revolution to finesse it. So he said, look, we're going to have a revolution to get equal rights for freed black people, but we're not going to end slavery. And that way, maybe I can get enough white people supporting me that I can, kind of split the baby. I don't have to take an ethical stand. I don't have to take a moral stand. I'll just kind of try and walk down the middle. And it turned out white people didn't really vibe with that. So that didn't work. I'm about to get into how he actually did it, but I want to set the tone because I think this is really important. So if you go to 1797, at this point, Toussaint has already basically running Haiti. And this guy, Vincent de Vaublanc, was lobbying the French government, and because Toussaint's running Haiti, but still a French colony. And he's already freed the slaves. And this guy's like, look, I need to lobby the government because we can't let black people run this colony. Like, that's crazy. And he writes basically the most racist attack you could ever imagine. And he's like, these guys are ignorant and brutish Negroes. They're savages. You can't have savages running the island. They're going to destroy the economy. Like, it's going to be the end. Like, we're going to lose the colony. What are you doing, guys? And Toussaint's response was key because it's indicative of all the things that he did. He said, look, blacks are not lazy and ignorant savages. Slavery makes them so. He separated the color from the culture. The culture was driving the behavior. And then he goes on to show the Haitian Revolution has been less brutal and less savage than the French Revolution was. The economy is actually booming. He proved that it was a culture. So how did he change the culture? There are 4 keys to how he changed it, or 4 keys that I'm going to highlight. There were probably a lot more keys than that. So the first is he kept what worked. We'll get into that. The second is he created very shocking rules that caused people to change their behavior. The third was he incorporated people from other cultures and adopted their way of doing things. And then finally, his decisions demonstrated his priorities. So first, keeping what works. So when they started the revolution, Toussaint, everybody wanted to join. He was a very charismatic guy, very well-connected guy. He knew everybody. They all knew he was super smart. And so everybody wanted to join. And he said, look, I'm only going to take a small group at first because the tactic that I'm going to use, we can win with just a small group of people because we're going to introduce a communication technology that the opposition doesn't have. And that technology came from one of the strengths of slave culture, which was music. And so what Toussaint did was he set up particularly the women on the outside and had them sing certain songs that all his guys knew encoded with the exact maneuvers and attacks that he wanted them to do. So by doing that, he had long-range communication. He was fighting the British and the Spanish early on, and they were like passing messages, walking stuff around, lining up. So they had to be all together in the middle, as that picture depicts, because they didn't have any way of communicating with each other otherwise, whereas Toussaint could. He had more advanced technology based out of slave culture. The second thing he did is he created shocking rules. And shocking rules, like particularly when you get into a company, end up being the important thing because people have to question, they have to ask themselves, why does this rule even exist in order to change their behavior? And so the really crazy, shocking rule that he created was officers cannot cheat on their wives. And remember, like everybody is raping and pillaging in these days, like you win, you get to rape and pillage. So how do you go from that to like, I'm not even allowed to cheat on my wife? And the reason he did that is because remember, one of the big problems with slavery is there's no loyalty because you're in an environment where tomorrow doesn't matter. And so how do you build loyalty? Well, you say, look, you gave your word when you got married. If you're not keeping that word, how can we trust you to keep any word? You can't be part of this if you can't keep your word. And he famously said, I'd rather relinquish my command than break my word. And so by saying, look, officers cannot be officers if they cheat on their wives, he made it clear to everybody in his organization that keeping your word, that was one of our corporate values. That was part of our culture. You couldn't play in this culture without doing that. Next thing he did was incorporate other cultures. And this was very unusual because you have to remember, he's running a slave army. You know, he's been oppressed, horrible oppression by the white people on the island. And he decides, and although he was a slave, Toussaint knew how to read, and not only did he know how to read, but he had read the complete works of Julius Caesar. And one of the things he got from Caesar was that as Caesar built the Roman Empire, he wouldn't kill the people he conquered. So when he'd go in and he'd conquer an area, he'd leave them in place. And the reason he left them in place is they were going to be part of the empire, and he needed somebody who knew that culture running that region. So he did not what we did when we went into Iraq and kind of cut the top off of the country, and then it went crazy in chaos. He knew better. It's funny, Julius Caesar knew that. We didn't know how to do that. But he knew not to do that. He knew to leave those guys in place so that they could succeed and go on. Toussaint also wanted to do something culturally, but he didn't want to preserve the culture. He wanted to change his culture. And so when he defeated the Spanish or defeated the British, what he did was he incorporated them and made those guys officers in his army. And that moved the culture much, much faster than it otherwise would have moved because they had much more advanced cultures. They came from cultures who had a lot of the elements that he needed to build a winning army. And then finally, make decisions that demonstrate priorities. So what was the big decision he had? Well, he abolishes slavery, he kind of defeats his enemies. What are you going to do with the slave masters? That's a big thing, right? Like, what would your instinct be? Kill those guys, right? But what he did was he said, look, we need them for the economy because they're the ones who know how to run these plantations. So we're not only not going to kill them, we're going to say you can't have slaves, but you have to pay your labor, but we'll lower your taxes to make that possible. So he completely changed. He just removed the past and said, we're going forward together. This is going to be one country. So what were the results of this? First result, something called the Toussaint Clause. So in 1799, just to demonstrate how powerful this, in 1799, the French and U.S. were in something that was known as the quasi-war. They didn't call it the war, so that'd be fake news. It's the quasi-war. They're just shooting each other over stupid stuff. And as part of that, the U.S. put an embargo on all the French colonies, including Haiti. Now, Haiti was already kind of breaking from France, and Toussaint needed that trade in order to basically continue the prosperity of the island. So he sends a white diplomat to the United States. The white diplomat meets with John Adams, President John Adams, Timothy Pickering, the Secretary of State, and basically convinces them to exempt only Haiti, and they had to do it in a secret language because they didn't want France to get mad. But it was so transparent that in the U.S., in the Congress, in all the documentation, they just call it the Toussaint Clause. And you have to understand, he brokers this deal. This is a black ex-slave cutting a deal with the United States who didn't outlaw slavery for another 65 years in 1799. And as a footnote to that, Timothy Pickering sends Toussaint a note telling him this and signs it, your obedient servant, which is the way they signed a lot of stuff. But imagine that, the United States signing that to an ex-slave. I'm your servant. How about that? That's a result of culture. So it's the only successful slave revolt in human history, creates a booming economy and a world-class culture. Under Toussaint, Haiti had more export income than the United States, so super successful as a country. He defeated the Spanish, the French, and ultimately they defeated Napoleon, actually after Toussaint got captured. And his successor abandoned the cultural thing. Once they defeated Napoleon, he killed all the white people in Haiti, and the economy fell apart, and all those things that you would expect. So culture really mattered. Okay, great. That was a lot. How does it apply to me? What about me, Ben? What is this? So keep what works. So some of you guys know Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs came back to Apple. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, they were about 3 weeks away from bankruptcy. And the conventional wisdom across the board, everybody said this, every financial analyst, every industry analyst, the problem with Apple is they need to be more like Microsoft. Anybody old enough would remember this. You have to be more like Microsoft. You've got to separate Mac OS off of the Mac, and you've got to get clone makers to make, it, and you got to go into the operating system market because PC economics has wiped it out. And that's what you have to do. And actually his predecessor, Gil Amelio, was doing just that. Jobs comes in and he says, what are you talking about? That's not who we are. Let me tell you what we're good at. We're good at building integrated stuff. And so not only am I going to kill all the clone manufacturers, but I'm going to make it more vertical. I'm going to build more hardware. I'm going to add a music player. I'm going to build stores. I'm going to go completely vertical because that's what we're good at design. We're good at the end-to-end experience. That's our culture. So you have to keep what's work. You want to change the culture, but you got to keep what's good about your culture. Second example, create shocking rules. So Mark Zuckerberg has this great rule. Move fast and break things. Now, he could have said, we're innovative. We've got a company value of innovation. Put that on the wall, innovative. And you know what? Everybody would have looked at it and go, oh yeah, we're innovative. But you go, move fast and break things. And you're like, what? What? Break things? You want me to break things? I was an engineer. I fix things. Break things. Why do you have that rule? That's the key. If you get your employees asking themselves, why are we doing it this way? Then they're going to think about that answer when it comes. And the answer is innovation is even more important than like breaking things, getting into trouble, quality at times even. Anybody who's a developer on Facebook knows this. Oh, just kidding, that was a tease. I love Facebook. You guys, some of you had some Facebook developers here. But move fast and break things creates that shock value that actually makes them an innovative culture. And if you look at them today, like one of the things they do is they move fast. Like the innovation, the new products coming out of Facebook is astounding because that was their culture. Incorporating outside leadership. This is a funny one. Google they built Google Apps like 5 years before Microsoft really got going with Office 365, and Microsoft ran right by them. Why? Because there was no enterprise culture in Google. None. Nobody would do it. Steve Ballmer used to go to see like CIOs, and he'd go, "Are you going to buy from me or from Google?" "Well, why don't you see if Larry Page will come visit you?" And guess what? Larry Page never visited any of those guys because that wasn't their culture. Their culture wasn't enterprise. So they went out and got Diane Green. And Diane Green, one of the great enterprise people ever, but this was like an impossible thing to do because she was on the board of Alphabet. She still is on the board of Alphabet. How do you take a board member and like put him under Sundar, under Google, under Larry, and have her run this? Well, you have to be very convincing, and you have to be committed to it. And the final thing, you have to make decisions that demonstrate priorities. So this is Reed Hastings, CEO of Netflix, and this was at our tech summit. And we're asking Reed, Mark, my partner Mark, is asking Reed, he's like, Reed, so you started out in the DVD delivery business, and then you went to streaming, how did you make that transition? How did you do it culturally? How did that happen? And Reed said, it's interesting because we started out, the metaphor was it was a network. The DVD delivery thing was a network. It was high bandwidth, we could deliver a lot of big payload, but it was really high latency, 3 days. So no networking geeks, not 3 milliseconds, 3 days. So that was the network, he said. And then we knew streaming was going to happen at some point. We just didn't know when. He said, but we really wanted to be a first-class streaming company, and we couldn't do that if we were totally focused on DVD delivery logistics. He said, well, how did you handle that? And basically, Reed said, well, it all happened one day. And on that day, and DVDs was 100% of our revenue. And we had a whole giant team running that business. And one day I said, you guys aren't allowed to come to staff meeting anymore. He said it was a really hard day. They were really sad. Can you imagine that? The team running all of your revenue is no longer allowed in the executive staff meeting where you're talking about the future and the strategy of the company. That's an extreme decision. Why would you make that? Well, if you're really going to be number one in streaming and you're going to beat all of the people, every startup that's going into it, you've got to make it really clear to the company, that's the future. We're not messing around here. And he did just that. So look, I know that culture sounds abstract and I know it sounds hard, but I'm telling you, just like the old guys told me, it's really important. When you build a company, there's almost nothing that's more important than culture. And if this guy could overcome being a slave for 40 years and completely change a slave culture and defeat the French, the British, and the Spanish and free the slaves of Haiti 65 years before they were freed in the United States, then you can change your company and make it great. So thank you.